Hey everyone, this is Ezekiel O'Callahan with Raptor Chatter, and we're going to be looking at the top 10 paleontology topics, not papers, of 2022. And I say topics because some of these span multiple papers, and our first topic is actually a great example of that, because it has a lot to do with Tyrannosaurus and whether or not it had more species, or if it was just one Tyrannosaurus Rex. Now, to understand the idea of multiple species, we're first going to look at big cats, specifically in the genus Panthera. So you have things like Panthera leo, the lion, but also you have things like Panthera onca, the jaguar. Each one of the different species of big cats has a different species name. So Tyrannosaurus is the genus and Rex is the species. And it's just arguing, hey, maybe there's more than one species in the genus Tyrannosaurus. And this paper that first came out to try and help propose this idea, it didn't use a ton of characters, which is a bit of a problem that I'll get into here in a minute. But essentially it says, hey, some of these teeth are rotated slightly, and some of the animals are actually a little bit more robust rather than more gracile. And so maybe there are more than one species. And also to help show this, they used a stratigraphic framework, which is essentially, hey, there were 2 million years of rock laid down, and we find Tyrannosaurus Rex throughout all of that. And some of them are obviously going to be earlier in that 2 million years, and some of them are going to be later in that 2 million years. And they were really able to try and suggest, hey, maybe these first ones are different. Maybe they're Tyrannosaurus imperator, as they newly named this species, or the emperor tyrant. And then later on, it evolved and split into two separate species, Tyrannosaurus rex, which we know, and Tyrannosaurus regina. If you want more on this paper, you can actually check out my specific video on it. However, a few months later, there was another team of researchers that actually looked at that first paper and said, yeah, no, this data isn't actually relevant. And one of the best ways to show that is with this graph showing robustness, and they're showing variability. So using the variability of robustness of the femur, which is what the first paper used to say, hey, some are more robust, some are more gracile, and try and split the species that way, they go, the variation we see is pretty much identical to the variation we see in a lot of modern birds. So it's really not statistically significant that there's that much variation. That seems like it could still be variation within a species. And the same thing kind of holds with teeth. Teeth are not consistent at all. For example, I only had 3 wisdom teeth. It makes sense that some Tyrannosaurus rex might have teeth that are slightly different, although still following the same general trends. That's not to say the first paper was all bad, it's at least starting some of these conversations, because some other researchers have noticed there are some differences in the variation in some Tyrannosaurus rex specimens. It's just that first paper didn't really provide good evidence for that, so we're going to need to do some more research to really nail down whether or not it is one species or if it is multiple species. But for right now, one species seems to be winning. And then there's the other big controversial topic, which is on Spinosaurus. Now, Spinosaurus in 2014, there was a new specimen found, which is great, and the bones were slightly more dense than other dinosaurs, and it was found to have pretty short legs. So the authors suggested, hey, it was probably swimming through the water after prey like fish, and it was hunting and living its lifestyle that way. And immediately a couple of other authors and researchers went, no, I don't think it was actually swimming through the water, at least based on the evidence we have. And there's been kind of this back and forth in academic circles and with research for the last few years. I mean, the 8 years since it was found. And that brings us to the beginning of this year, where there was a paper looking at the density and trying to quantify that density in Spinosaurus bones and saying, yeah, these are statistically important numbers that we're getting from the density of these bones. They do align more with animals that are swimming in the water that are tetrapods. So tetrapods being essentially all 4-legged vertebrates that are on land. Hey, this is the same as those. It has the same kind of density, it was probably swimming in the water. And this leads us to a couple of preprints because I haven't seen them officially published anywhere. And all a preprint is it's a paper that was submitted to a scientific journal and they say we will publish this after it's peer reviewed. So it's still pretty good science, it just needs a little bit of refinement. And the first one says, hey, that paper that looked at bone density, it had a sampling bias. And the next one said, no, we didn't have a sampling bias. And then finally we have the final paper, which is fully published and peer-reviewed, which is Spinosaurus is not an aquatic dinosaur, which provides a bunch of evidence using 3D models that say, no, Spinosaurus probably was too buoyant to actually swim to the bottom and actually try and hunt while swimming in the water. Now, those models may not be perfectly accurate, but no model ever is. It's just that some models are useful. And based on the models we have right now, I personally feel that Spinosaurus probably wasn't that aquatic. It wasn't swimming through the water after prey. It still probably could have swam pretty well, but that's probably not its lifestyle. Instead, it seems like there's a lot of papers, including the one by Hone and Holtz in 2021, which you can check out my video on, that seem to suggest a more heron-like lifestyle. It would have been waiting in the shadows and then snapping at fish as they swam by. It wasn't all big famous dinosaurs though. Sometimes it was much smaller things that are actually a lot more common today. Things like corals and jellyfish. This is a group called Cnidarians, and these two papers actually looked at some of the first records of them in the fossil record. The first paper is describing a new species of fossil cnidarian coming from the E.D.G.E, so before the Cambrian explosion, when most of the life that we're actually really familiar with really starts to show up in the fossil record. Aurora lumina Attenboroughii helps to really fill in this kind of gap that we have in the fossil record towards more modern corals, and this graph shows that really well. So this graph just shows the general kind of morphological variation that you're getting in these groups. And the light blue is showing the E.D.G.E fossils. So this is just, hey, these are what we have in the E.D.G.E, but then you also have the orange, which shows the Cambrian. And the dark blue shows what's happening if you include Aurora lumina. So you can see that this fossil really helps fill in this gap towards the more modern types of corals, and especially the Cambrian corals that we have a better fossil record of. The other fossil is also a fossil that actually is already known, but it spans from the E.D.G.E into the Cambrian, and it was also found to be related to the Cnidarians. This is because normally you don't have soft tissue preservation, meaning all the soft parts are gone, you just have these kind of hard shelly parts. And what they found is that there's a number of tentacles in round 1 that actually does have that soft tissue preservation. Gaintucunia is the name of the fossil, and previously, because it's just kind of this hard tube-like structure, some people thought, hey, maybe it's a tube worm, but other people thought, hey, maybe it is a cnidarian. And again, soft tissue, we know it's a cnidarian now. And the thing is, cnidarians have a complex, but in some respects, simple lifestyle, just the more intricate details that get complex, because they basically have two separate lives. The first is as a polyp, so you can think of corals, they pop out of their polyp and they filter feed. But then you also have things like the medusas, or jellyfish, where they float around. And the thing is, even corals have a really similar lifestyle. It's really easy to think of corals as just reef builders, but when they're polyps and young, they float around like these medusas. They float around like jellyfish with the tentacles all facing down. So it's this kind of twofold life cycle that different animals in this group have taken to different extremes. And it's really funny to me that this one actually seems to be closer to the Medusazoans, meaning that one of the first fossil skeletons we have, because the polyp part is at least hard, comes from something related to jellyfish, which famously don't have skeletons. So it wasn't all dinosaurs, but there were also some things that were living under the feet of some of the earliest dinosaurs, and that's going to be the lizards, or at least some of the lizards' relatives. In general, we think about the lizards, which are squamates, evolving around 200 million years ago. Except there's a new fossil from 200 million years ago that shows a very advanced squamate. Based on what we've actually looked at with this animal in the fossil record and comparing it to other animals, it's a pretty developed and derived squamate, meaning it's essentially from a very late evolving group. And because of these similarities to the anguiforms and especially the varanids, it was actually named Cryptovaranoides. And if this holds, it essentially just tells us that, hey, the entire group of the anguiforms evolved a lot earlier than we thought, because we really only get things like the varanids much later, many tens of millions of years later. So that also suggests that the first lizards would have needed to evolve tens of millions of years earlier, probably around 230 million years ago. So this one animal, Cryptovaranoides, might just throw a massive wrench into what we thought we knew about lizard evolution. The thing is though, there are other fossils of things called the rhynchosaurs, which is the next group related to lizards, and it includes only the modern day Tuatara and many fossil representatives. And the thing is, we have some early ones of these from around 230 million years ago. But unlike Cryptovaranoides, which is really, really well preserved, they're pretty much just isolated jaw fragments, so the truth could really end up on either side of this argument. And the Triassic is also when the first dinosaurs evolved, but they were in general still fairly small. This is things like Coelophysis, and that's largely because many of the larger niches that would have been in the environment were filled by pseudosuchians, so land-based crocodile-like animals. These are, for the herbivorous animals, the Aedosaurs, but then you also have some animals like Poposaurus or Prestosuchus, which were very large predators on land at that time. During the end of the Triassic, though, there was a mass extinction, and what we see is not necessarily a big die-off of a lot of different animals, but instead a transition. Most of those pseudosuchians died out, and pretty much the only ones we had left were the ones living in water. Meanwhile, the dinosaurs exploded in diversity, and it's been thought, hey, there's a lot of different reasons this could have been, and there were many papers that actually looked at some of these reasons. The first one looked at the CAMP, or Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. Essentially, as Pangea started to break up, there's a lot of volcanism in the middle of that, and that would have changed the climate. By kind of measuring diversity of what we have in the fossil record and trying to time it with different parts of that eruption, these researchers in the first paper found that actually it seems like the dinosaurs weren't directly affected by the camp eruptions. Instead, they were able to survive, but then didn't really diversify greatly until later, in kind of the middle Jurassic, which unfortunately we don't have a great fossil record from. But there were still other papers that helped us understand at least how they survived. The main thing different researchers did is first they looked at the environment and found, hey, during some periods of the camp eruptions, the climate and average temperature actually cooled pretty significantly. There were large bodies of ice in some of the mountains in places like northern China, for example. And this means that that coolness would have actually created a lot of different types of environments from the Triassic, which was pretty warm. And it turns out that the dinosaurs were probably warm-blooded, and that may have led to their success over things like the crocodilian relatives. In fact, it's kind of why, especially early on, we don't really find crocodilians that far north relative to dinosaurs, which can get all the way into polar regions. For example, Cryolophosaurus, which was found in Antarctica. And there was another paper that pretty much found the same thing with mammals, where they found, hey, the mammals probably evolved warm-bloodedness around 200 million years ago, and essentially that because of that, they were able to make it through that extinction better. Meanwhile, the non-mammal and non-warm-blooded mammal relatives pretty much died out during that extinction. So it was really good for warm-blooded animals, and they were able to then go and diversify and help populate the planet with new kinds of life. But of course, they weren't the only organisms diversifying at this time. There were also plants. And what you need to understand is when the first dinosaurs evolved, you pretty much only had gymnosperms as the main trees that were around. Gymnosperms being things like conifers, cycads, and ginkgos. They don't have flowers or even fruit. But we do know at some point, based on the later fossil record and genetic evidence, that at some point during the Jurassic or the Cretaceous, the first flowering plants, the angiosperms, did evolve. And we're actually starting to get more and more fossils of angiosperms from earlier and earlier. And this includes 2 papers that showed the first evidence of some of these angiosperms from the middle Jurassic. And I actually think this is really funny because both kind of claim to have the earliest evidence of this, but they came out about a week apart. So the first one that came out actually has a fossil coming from China. Florigerminus jurassica shows parts of a flower as well as some of the fruit, all attached to a basic stem. And so really good evidence that, yeah, flowers and flowering plants had evolved by this point. The other one comes from Mexico, though, and again, Middle Jurassic. Dilgorafrutis mexicana is definitely the earliest occurrence of a flowering plant in North America. And by micro-CT scanning this fossil, which isn't as well preserved as the other one, they were able to find parts of the pericarp, which is just the fleshy kind of body around the seeds in a fruit. Both of them occurring in the Middle Jurassic means one of 2 things. Either A, they either just first evolved in the early Jurassic or Middle Jurassic and spread rapidly across the entire world, or B, they evolved potentially even as far back as the Triassic and we just don't have those fossils yet. But of course, dinosaurs also diversified around this time, and this includes with animals that eventually led to a very strange animal that lived in the Cretaceous in Argentina. So many, many million years of diversification, and then we suddenly find this strange dinosaur coming from Argentina. And it's strange for a number of reasons. The phylogenetic study actually found that it was pretty close to things like the stegosaurs and the ankylosaurs in a group called Thyreophoran, but it's also very early diverging, before either the ankylosaurs or the stegosaurs split from one another. Now, this animal is a subadult, about 4 to 5 feet long, so that also means that there's some portions that we could potentially use to identify which group it belonged to later. Essentially, if the animal kept growing, we might have been able to tell things like, oh, if it had a tail club, like the ankylosaurs grew once they got older. But we don't really have those fossils anyway. It's actually pretty partial, but you'll notice that the dentary, so the lower jawbone, is pretty wide, and that means it had really strong attachments for muscles. And we don't really find that in ankylosaurs or in the stegosaurs. So it's doing something really unique for a Thyreophoran. In fact, some researchers have suggested it might have been closer to ceratopsians or heterodontosaurs, both of which have those same kind of muscle attachments. But unfortunately, we don't really get ceratopsians from South America until the very end of the Cretaceous, so another 30 million years after Jakapil would have lived. What this all means is essentially that, hey, either the ceratopsians made it to South America much earlier than we thought and it was a really weird one that made it, or B, maybe a heterodontosaur actually made it to South America before the breakup of Pangaea and evolved into this separate category, or again, based on what we currently know based on the current evidence, it was a Thyreophoran, so one of these animals that was more heavily armored, closely related to stegosaurs or ankylosaurs, lived in South America, and they just kind of went on their own odd evolutionary journey that we just don't really have strong evidence of how that occurred, which is really frustrating because that means there's about a 130 million year gap between when we first have this animal where it should have diverged and then where we actually find it. So hopefully we'll find some fossils that help fill in that kind of gap so we can better understand what exactly was going on with this animal. And sticking with some strange dinosaurs, we're going to be looking at the earliest known therizinosaur, Fukuivenator. It comes from Japan, and for a long time it's just kind of been considered some kind of vague coelurosaur, which are things that essentially led to birds, but there's also much larger dinosaurs in there, like Tyrannosaurus. And the thing is, this makes a lot of sense. We've already known that it was likely omnivorous based on the forward teeth being much more designed for grabbing small prey, but then the back teeth having more peg-like structures, which is better for eating plants. So it makes a lot of sense that it would group here. The thing is though, there's also a couple of different characteristics that help us to better understand the therizinosaurs, which are this really strange group of dinosaurs as a whole. So for the therizinosaurs, think of things like Therizinosaurus, where Therizinosaurus is this massive theropod, except rather than being like the other theropods it was related to, like Tyrannosaurus Rex, it was entirely herbivorous with a very small head, but with giant scythe-like claws that it used to help pull and maneuver different types of branches towards its mouth. And there's a number of different features that help to align it with the therizinosaurs. One of the coolest of which is they micro-CT scanned the skull and were able to look at the brain case. And it turns out, like the other therizinosaurs that we have brain cases of, it looks like Fukuivenator had a really good sense of smell. So maybe with those fruits it was picking off some of those early fruits. But again, there could have been many other reasons for this. There could have been a lot of pressures leading to a better sense of smell, but it seems pretty consistent across the different therizinosaurs that they had this, so that's good. Fukuivenator, though, also had a preserved pygostyle, which is essentially just a specialized fusion of the last tail vertebra, which helps to make a kind of fan of feathers. When you look at things like the raptor dinosaurs and their reconstructions, a lot of times you'll see the tail has a V at the end of the tip in the feathers and the fan that's making up the end of that tail. It's because it doesn't have that same kind of fusion in those last tail feathers. That also means therizinosaurs may have actually had the kind of asymmetrical flight type feathers that the modern day birds do. Now I do want to be clear, I'm not trying to suggest that Fukuivenator flew, instead it just may have had similar types of feathers as many modern day birds do. And looking at the dinosaurs and especially the end of them, there was a paper that suggested, hey, in the northern hemisphere when the big rock came down and killed off the non-bird dinosaurs, it was springtime, which would have been pretty devastating because you have all this new growth that the animals are relying on and then it just wiped away. So that's pretty rough. But this is based especially on many fish fossils from the so-called Tannocite, which it's believed these fish were swimming just before the impact happened, and then they died just after the impact. And this is because inside the gill rakers these animals would have used to filter feed, we find impact spherules. So essentially, when all the material got thrown up by the impact, a lot of it would have been burning and melting when it came back down and turned into little glass beads, which then landed in the water and these fish kind of breathed them in. Now, how did they get the time of year from this? Well, they actually looked at the bone growth in these fish. And what they were able to do is look at the carbon isotopes in those bones and correlate those different carbon isotopes to different seasons. And it seems like there was a decrease in the growth just before you start getting a little bit of new growth, and then the fish died, probably due to that impact. So it's really good evidence that this impact did happen in the early spring. And I will also say, if you want more on this paper, check out the author's video on this. Melanie During had somebody try and essentially steal this paper from her, so she could really use the support because, you know, the person who stole it is kind of a jerk. Allegedly stole it, I will say. And finally, moving more towards modern day mammals and some fossil mammals, there was a look at the last 130,000 years of mammal communities, especially across North America, but also Australia. And this is important because they essentially looked at it and went, yeah, a lot of these have died. I mean, it's that straightforward. Essentially, they looked at the communities that would have been present in these different fossil environments and even up to modern day environments and found that pretty much half of these different links between different animals have been lost in the last 130,000 years. There's been a significant die-off and loss of different complexity in different environments. And that could be an issue. Sometimes when researchers are talking about extinctions, you need to think of almost a stack of different buckets, where one species makes up one part of the community, makes up part of the larger community that's much broader. And then that species also has a bucket on top of it of individuals. So if you lose something like a species, there's going to be a sloshing of that bucket. It's essentially going to spill over into the lower buckets. And after a while, those buckets will get full, meaning they're going to be less able to try and actually rebound from some of this different structuring. Near me, you can think of it as in within the last 100 years, hunters took out the elk population that was present in Flagstaff. And because of that, there was a shift and an increase in numbers of the mule deer population. So that lower bucket was able to capture and help stop the fallout from losing the elk. We've then reintroduced elk and there's been different problems, but again, the community is structuring itself in such a way that's more or less stable. The problem is if you lose a lot of those species at once, you're going to end up with a community that isn't able to rebound. It isn't able to catch all that water and lower that impact. And so when we're looking at modern day environmental issues, we really need to stop and consider, especially based on the fossil record and what we've seen before, how much communities can actually take before that kind of sloshing bucket effect doesn't work. And especially in the face of climate change, how much those buckets may be able to take. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. We also do a whole series of videos every month that look into many of the papers from each month in deeper detail. So if you're more into sciences, feel free to subscribe and check out all of those from last year. Because like I said, I delve into a lot of those papers in more detail and also into a lot of other papers that I didn't mention in this video. So if you're into the science, feel free to check us out. I will also say feel free to check out our links below, including our Patreon, where, it really helps us keep the lights on. We got day jobs and things, so having that extra income is really nice for making sure people are content and happy with what we're making. With all that in mind, everyone, be safe, take care, and do not go extinct, please. That'd be rough for all of us.